Good morning. Hello, everyone. Well, it may be the afternoon or even the evening where you are in the world. So hello, welcome. I'm excited for today's talk with John, and thank you everybody for being here today. Really looking forward to it. If you're here, feel free to say hello in the chat. We're going to wait a couple minutes for everybody to show up, who is going to show up today. So hello again. Alyssa, hello, Pam. Thank you, everybody, for being here. Welcome. How are you? Hello in Georgia and California and Florida and New York. Hello in Boston and Denmark and Iowa. Hello, everybody. We're just going to wait another minute or so before we get started. If you're here, feel free to say hello. I'm happy to be hosting today's talk with John. I always find I learned some interesting and thoughtful ideas. You can tell that he's an award-winning educator. He knows how to communicate, in my opinion. So thank you. Hello, Mary. Hello in Winnipeg. Hello in New York, North Carolina. Hello in Ontario. Hello, everybody. Oh, so Linda just said he's awesome, John. So I think you are.
Thank you.
Hello, Sharon in Maryland. Hello in Mexico and in the UK and Coburg. Hello, everybody. So let's just wait another second. I'm going to pull up my notes before we get started. Thank you, everybody, for being here. Always, always good to see your names. So, 1 second, and we will get started. Hello, writers. This is Jacob Jans with the Writers Workshop at Authors Publish. Today, I'm pleased to introduce Claude Bemis, who will be giving a talk on creating captivating characters for readers and publishers. This talk is part of our lecture series where we host talks on the craft of writing and the business of publishing. Claude Bemis is an award-winning educator and author with books published by Penguin Random House and Disney Hyperion. He's also an instructor for the Writers Workshop at Authors Publish. Thank you, John, for being here. Welcome. How are you?
Yeah, I always love getting to do these lectures. So it's been a little while since I've had a chance to do one. Things have been busy, but I'm glad to be back and excited to get to talk to you all today.
Yeah, really happy that you're here. So if you are ready, feel free to go ahead and get started.
Sounds great. All right, my friends, welcome. Glad to get to talk to you this morning. I'm going to share my screen with my slides here. All right. Well, today, as we look at captivating characters, um, you know, Greek mythology is certainly full of captivating characters. And Zeus and Athena, who we see here in these images, are two of the most iconic characters of Greek mythology. And I think the origin story of Athena kind of sets up a nice metaphor for what we are going to be talking about today with characters. So, as the story goes, Zeus has this unbelievable headache one day, and it just goes on and on and on, and it is driving him crazy. It's pounding inside his head, and it will not stop until finally he calls his son Hephaestus, who is the blacksmith god, to do what you would do when you get a headache and just like crack his head open with a hammer. And when he does, Athena springs from his skull. She is born literally from the skull of Zeus, and not as a little baby, but as an adult. She springs fully formed. And that is often the way characters spring from our imaginations, that many times they come out feeling like they are alive. They have this life of their own, that there's so many things that we had no idea of where these ideas came from. This character feels so vivid and compelling, and we want to write about them. But the truth is that even when they come out that way, they might not be quite complete. In fact, they are not complete. Even the most vivid characters springing from our imaginations need some shaping, need some refining, still need some development. And so today we're going to explore some techniques to help you better shape your characters. So let us begin with first impressions. we only get one chance at a first impression, as you know, and certainly the first impression that I would not want from people is to see me first thing in the morning when I'm just waking up, before I've even brushed my teeth or been able to start my day. A first impression in real life, we would like to come across with a good, positive, memorable first impression. And the same is true for our characters. So I encourage you, as you think about the opening scenes to your story, whether you're first introducing your protagonist or maybe even some of the secondary casts, is to come in with a strong first impression, something that will be memorable. And I think that this comes to this whole idea of what you want to do in the opening of a story in order to hook readers. And in my opinion, the most important thing that is going to get a reader emotionally invested in your story is to get emotionally invested in your character, is to give them that sort of emotional hook. If they care about the character, then they will care about learning the exposition, the backstory. Then they'll get invested in learning about the plot. But sometimes as writers, we start to front load the story with too much exposition, too much explaining, too much backstory, without getting the reader properly invested in caring about our characters. So there are two things that I want to emphasize that I think can help you to come across with that strong first impression for your protagonist that is going to emotionally hook readers. And this is something that I often lean into when I am first introducing my character and deciding what I want to show in the opening scenes, opening chapters, as I'm introducing this character. And that is to lean into building sympathy for this character and giving readers a reason to potentially envy or admire this character. When we think about an iconic character like Cinderella, think about how she is first introduced, where that story builds a lot of sympathy for her predicament. We feel bad for poor Cinderella being abused, neglected, unloved, treated in this horrible way. But we also have a sense for kind of envy and admiring her because, first of all, she has a fairy godmother that we learn really quickly. And who wouldn't want a fairy godmother? That's pretty incredible. And she gets an invitation to a royal ball. These are enviable things that occur to her relatively early in the story, not unlike the introduction of Harry Potter in those stories, where there's a lot of sympathy in the way he's being raised, and then the kind of envy and admiration when he gets the invitation to go to Hogwarts. So to just emphasize this point, let me show you a couple other examples that come from, because we've had characters throughout history that have, for thousands of years, that have stood the test of time because of their first introductions, early introductions that they've had. King Arthur being one of them. In the story of King Arthur, often we are introduced to him where his father is dead, and there are rival kings that would want to kill baby Arthur. So Merlin has to put him into hiding. This is a reason that we feel sorry for baby Arthur. And he grows up not knowing about his heritage, being raised by his uncle. And even in the T.H. White version of the story, the once and future king, they call him Wart. He's not even called by his true name, Arthur. He's being called Wart, this kind of diminishing name. But of course, we have a reason to envy Arthur because we know as the reader that he is the rightful king. And when he pulls the sword from the stone, he proves to himself and to others that, he is actually the once and future king. He is going to become the king of England. We see it in modern literature too, with a very popular YA story from several years ago, The Hate You Give by Angie Thomas, which introduces her protagonist, Star Carter, as coming from this poor neighborhood, from this kind of disadvantaged background, but able to go to this elite private school. So kind of reasons to sympathize and envy her at the same time. And we also sympathize with her being caught between these two worlds, but also envy and admire how well she is able to navigate going between them, this kind of code switching between these two sides of her life. So think about, as you are developing those early scenes, of how you might lean into picking things that is that are going to occur, or backstory that you're going to emphasize, or exposition that you're going to emphasize in the beginning, that will kind of give a clear sense, for what is going to build sympathy in the reader. Some of these sort of aspects. Certainly, this is why we see so many orphans in literature. It's kind of an easy way just to build sympathy right off the bat for a character. But how we might also, because we might feel sorry for a character, but that doesn't mean we're necessarily going to love them or even like them. So the envy and admiration helps to build that. And it's this kind of psychological component to it, of how it plays on the reader's feelings going forward. The sympathy makes the reader want to see change, want to see something good happen for this character as the story goes forward. But we also have a reason to get kind of invested in this character and admire them. It's fiction, after all. We like to see things that are bigger than life. We like to see people who have a particular talent, or are particularly clever, or even a character that's simply funny. Introducing a character that might come from wealth or power, like in The Godfather, where Michael Corleone comes from that sort of family, is a reason to envy and admire them. But if nothing else, a lot of times we envy characters simply because they live in an interesting world. In historical fiction, maybe they live at an interesting time in history. In a fantasy story, maybe we envy them because they live in this kind of unusual and magical or science fiction story, some like extraordinary place, or like a Michael Corleone again, who is simply just getting to grow up in an interesting home environment with a family who is in the mafia. So think about those two techniques, sympathy and envy. All right. So the next thing that I would suggest as you think about how to make your characters more captivating is looking at active protagonists. But let's start first by thinking about just clarifying what the protagonist is. Of course, the protagonist is the main character of your story, but likely the protagonist is, or should be, the character that the reader is most emotionally invested in, with that proper setup that we just saw. But also the protagonist is going to be the character who struggles and changes the most across the story. If you have a protagonist who is not that character, if there's some other character in your story who is really struggling and changing the most, think about whether that character should actually be the protagonist of your story. The protagonist is one who is going to be ideally an active protagonist. Struggle and change will force your character into being that sort of active protagonist. But let's clarify what we mean also by active protagonist versus what we don't want to have in a story, and certainly what publishers don't want to see in a protagonist, which is having a passive protagonist. A passive protagonist is a main character who lacks a lot of agency. They don't have a lot of control over their circumstances. They don't have the ability to take action. And you might think, well, what about those stories where a character is in prison in a situation like that? Don't they lack agency and the ability to take action? Well, certainly. But notice how those characters are often framed in stories. That prisoner who wants to find a way to escape, or is simply taking action, trying to survive the circumstances of their imprisonment. So there are ways that you can make your character active, even in a situation that is restricting their ability to affect change over the circumstances of their life. You're going to have a passive protagonist also if you realize that your protagonist is mostly just observing other characters doing the most interesting things in the story. If secondary characters are the ones that are really driving the plot forward, and your protagonist is just kind of in the passenger seat going along for the ride, then that's putting them in a more passive position. And while some of that might occur towards the beginning of a story as you're setting things up, you most certainly won't by the middle of the story and through the end for your protagonist to not be the one just observing others doing the interesting stuff, but being the one who drives the plot and drives the story at that point. The other quality of a passive protagonist that we don't want is that they get easy solutions to problems. That when something comes up, that it is solved through convenience, it's solved through kind of good luck, it's solved through just some secondary character coming along and helping them and saving the day, rather than you as the writer putting your protagonists in a position where they are the ones that have to struggle and find the solution. So let's now just clarify what the actor protagonist is going to do, what you do want to have happen. As I said, driving that plot forward, taking action, making hard choices. Put your protagonist in some sort of dilemma where they have very difficult choices, not just easy choices to make, but hard choices to make. This is called giving a character agency and control, that they have some measure of autonomy over the situation. Not complete autonomy, because that takes some of the fun out of the story, but they need to have just enough to keep the reader excited for these decisions and surprising things that the character is doing that's driving things forward. And of course, that they struggle for any sort of advancement in the story. Because what I sometimes see, I work with a lot of writers and I read a lot of manuscripts and I read a lot of chapters and give a lot of feedback. And sometimes what writers are doing that is relatively easy to punch up and improve is that they are just making their characters a little too passive in situations. If they want their protagonist to learn some information, then some other secondary character just comes along and explains it all to them. Whereas it's a little more interesting if your protagonist has to struggle or do something to kind of earn that information. If you, as the writer, want your character to make a new friend or to gain an ally in the story, then it puts them in a passive position if they just kind of meet and hit it off and they're just kind of fast friends in an easy, kind of convenient way. Whereas it's more interesting in fiction sometimes in real life, that's what happens. But in fiction, we want to see that friendship feel earned, that the two of them have done something to solidify this friendship through some sort of struggle or overcoming some sort of obstacles that stand in the way to their friendship or their just being allies. And of course, the same is true for like other things, like if a character needs a clue or needs some sort of helpful tool or needs to get to a certain place, or in a fantasy story needs some sort of spell or power, or in a science fiction story they need a spaceship or something like that, then make sure that character, your protagonist, is the one that is struggling and earning that thing that they need that is going to help to advance the story in a particular way. All right, so active and passive protagonists. We're going to keep building on this and the sympathy and envy as we go forward. But the last thing I want to say about active protagonists is one of the best ways, the one way that you can really kind of make sure that you are putting your protagonist in a more active position rather than a passive position, is to just simply give them a goal certainly an overall goal in the plot, something that they are trying to achieve by the end, that the reader is invested in seeing across the overall story. But on the smaller, more micro level of in individual chapters, in individual scenes, is far too often is giving that character a goal. Far too often a scene might start where a character is just kind of meandering, or just kind of like there's nothing that they particularly want. They're just going about their life. And then something happens that advances the plot. Well, even in a scene like that, you might just give them some sort of other minor goal to put them in a more active position. This is why there's that famous Kurt Vonnegut quote of every character should want something, even if it's a glass of water. And a glass of water, is not a particularly interesting and dramatic thing in and of itself. Although I could imagine how you might, a clever writer could certainly craft a scene where it could be very compelling situation where a character absolutely needs a glass of water and we're on the edge of our seat to see whether they get it. But this advice is framed in this way just simply because you should be looking for ways when you can make your character want something on each and every page, it is going to put your protagonist in that situation. They're more interesting, they're more dramatic, they are more active in the story. All right, let us look at some key traits that we see in compelling characters in our stories. The protagonists, but also potentially our antagonists, if you have one, and our secondary cast of characters. Now, the first one, cleverness, this one is a little more specific to the protagonist. It is rare in a story to have just a dumb protagonist. Certainly in comedies, you might have a dumb protagonist, and that kind of works to comedic effect in the story. Or in a horror movie, sometimes the reader can go along with having a dumber protagonist who makes bad choices because it's helping to make the situation, we've all watched those horror movies and things where we're like, oh, what are you doing? Don't do that kind of thing. That kind of is part of the fun of it. But in most other stories, the protagonist is going to be someone who shows some measure of cleverness. They do not have to be a genius. But to be a little above average in their smarts in how they are handling the story. And certainly we have characters who might be a little more naive at the beginning, a little more clueless, and that's part of the arc of their character is that they're gaining maturity. But for the most part, a compelling character is one who is smart or has some street smarts, common sense, is going to make interesting choices and figure things out in the story. Courage is another key trait of interesting characters, especially courage when it counts. Again, we might see a character at the beginning of the story who starts off a little meek, a little hesitant, with a little less courage. And part of their arc in the story is how they gain courage, in particular in the last half of the story, and especially at the climax, where almost always that the choice, the action, whatever comes at the climax that the protagonist in particular is doing to resolve the story is one that requires a lot of bravery, a lot of courage. Even if it's not life or death kind of situation, it could be just kind of emotional or courage to face whatever problem it is that they're trying to resolve. A compelling character is often one too who shows strong emotions, or maybe doesn't show strong emotions to the other characters. We can sometimes have a protagonist who comes across a little more stoic, but they feel strong emotions on the inside, and the reader has access to it, that they have deeply held beliefs, a philosophy of life that is a vivid and compelling one that makes their actions, makes their choices come from a place that is rooted in very strong emotions and feelings. We like, as readers, you've seen it across history with some of the most compelling and memorable characters throughout time are these ones who are passionate, who are vivid, and feel alive because of their emotional lives that they have and their feelings that they have. And the last one, this is a little bit more for specific to the protagonist, but also the antagonist as well, is that a compelling protagonist is one that often is marked as special in the story, that they are unique, they are different than the other characters. If you go through your head and think about some of, the most famous protagonists in history, King Arthur or Wilbur the pig in Charlotte's Web or Harry Potter or whoever it might be, they are marked in some way as being different, unique, special, one of a kind. Think about how in fantasy literature, a lot of times there's this bad cliche of the chosen one, this character who is kind of, they have a particular destiny, that there's a prophecy that they are going to save the world. And this kind of feeling nowadays that trope has been overdone. But if you think about it, it actually comes from, I'm not arguing that you should do it, but I'm just saying that it comes from the right instinct, the right intent. It's a way that the writer is trying to mark the character as special in the story. Because we as readers are more invested in characters who have this quality of being unique because we want to be unique. We want to feel that we are one of a kind, that we have this quality of being different and special. And so we certainly demand that of our protagonists and our antagonists. And just as an example of it, think about Hamlet in Shakespeare. He is certainly not the only prince in the world whose father has been murdered and is trying to avenge, the death of their father. That doesn't mark Hamlet is particularly special. But in the context of the story, he is the only prince who is going through this. Note that he doesn't have siblings who are in the same position as him. He is the only one whose father's ghost has come to him, that's called to him. He is the one that is in this unique position of having to avenge his father's death. So look for that way to kind of mark your protagonist in particular as special and unique and different from others in the story. And here's just a little pro tip along these lines of some of these qualities. One that I use a lot, which is that we often will paint characters into a corner, give them a problem. It's an exciting scene, and we've thrown everything at this character just to, give them a very hard predicament to get out of. And we have to then figure out how to get the character out of this problem. Well, what you don't want to use is just, as I said before, just good luck, some convenient thing that occurs, some coincidence that gets them out of the problem, some secondary character that just kind of like easily solves things for them. What it often comes down to, that you're likely what you're going to use to solve this problem, is to have your character solve the problem through some sort of extraordinary courage or some sort of cleverness or some sort of kindness. And kindness sometimes, we might feel like, oh, really kindness, but don't dismiss it, because I won't spoil the ending of the movie Honora, but we had this Academy Award-winning movie, Honora, this year, that I think really got elevated to Academy Award material because of its ending, which hinges on kindness, on an act of kindness and an act of vulnerability. So sometimes those can be really powerful tools for your character to solve a problem. So tack these three things up in your office. And so when you are trying to get your character out of a jam, have them solve a problem, likely courage, cleverness, or kindness is going to make a more active character and a more interesting solution to whatever their problem is that they're facing. The next thing that I think is incredibly helpful for creating compelling characters is to think about archetypes. Now, an archetype is basically just a role that your character plays. And these are some basic roles that have existed for thousands of years in storytelling. The ruthless king, the mentor or guide, the fairy godmother. Even when we look at something like Winnie the Pooh, this classic story, that the characters often fall into archetypal roles. Pooh being sweet but kind of dumb. We have Tigger, who's this hyperactive character. Piglet, who is the one that is the kind of meek but loyal sidekick. Eeyore, who's the eternal pessimist. We see it in a lot of comedies where the secondary cast has these very distinct roles from one another. But we also see it in, again, like something like The Godfather, or something that has a big cast like Game of Thrones, or even Grapes of Wrath, where a lot of the secondary cast have these very distinct archetypal roles that they are playing. And most certainly, when you are developing characters, I understand that we all want to have characters who have depth, who have complexity, who have nuance. We don't want paper thin characters. We want rich characters. But the thing that you want to watch out for is that too many ingredients, too many qualities to a character can kind of ruin the flavor of it all. Things can get muddied when they have too many. So the more you can kind of concentrate certain qualities into specific characters, it makes them more distinct and makes them honestly just more compelling to your reader. And there's a whole number. I mean, there's not like one uniform list of archetypes. You'll see a lot out there, but they're often ones that you just kind of instinctively know because you've seen this pattern in literature of certain types of characters: an underdog character, a detective character, the mentor or guide to the hero, even the idea of an optimistic or a pessimistic character. Sometimes in certain school situations, we think of these archetypal roles of like the bully or the class clown, or the one that is the always a coward, or the one that is always the kind of brain, the know-it-all. kind of character. Or even like in Winnie the Pooh, you have that one character, I think Owl is kind of, he's the know-it-all, but he's actually not all that smart, you know, so that kind of character falls in its own kind of archetype. You know, Harry Potter is classically kind of a chosen one character. A Charlotte in Charlotte's Web plays the savior. You have so many of these mentor guides, like a Gandalf, a Dumbledore, a Merlin, even the fairy godmother in Cinderella. When you think about Romeo and Juliet as a story, I mean, certainly Romeo and Juliet have many particular qualities, but they are ultimately remembered as an archetypal couple of star-crossed lovers. And we see this archetype of star-crossed lovers show up again and again. And what can be helpful for you is just to think about, like to stand back and look at your story and think, oh yeah, I kind of have some star-crossed lovers in my story. Oh, this character, this secondary character is actually kind of playing more of a mentor guide role. And once you can identify that, you might accentuate some of those qualities and find ways to do this in interesting ways that you haven't seen done before with this particular archetype. It's not necessarily just to copy what other people have done, but to take inspiration from it and to find ways that you can use these to just make your character more interesting and distinguished. And don't assume just because of the type of story you're writing that this archetype is going to play out. Of course, we have detectives in a lot of mystery stories, but in a way, Hamlet is operating as an archetypal detective, trying to gather clues and evidence to prove that his uncle murdered his father. Most of the Harry Potter stories have Harry and his friends acting as detectives, solving some sort of mystery. We have this idea of secret royalty that, you know, again, from Shakespeare, where we have Prince Hal, who is hanging out with the commoners and pretending to be, you know, someone he's not. We also see it in, you know, more recently in Dune, where the secret royalty of Paul Atreides as he goes and lives among the Fremen. Underdog characters can show up in everything from fairy tales and fantasy, like Cinderella. Arguably, Harry Potter is an underdog character, but also in historical fiction, like with Wolf Hall. So these unlikely heroes in a way. And once you have kind of identified it, not only does it help you to create, can distinguish your character within the story, it can also help you a little bit with your plot as well, where you want to take the story, the events of it, you know, because often in a secret royalty, if you kind of realize like, oh yeah, I have a character who maybe isn't literally royalty, but they come from some sort of very privileged, powerful family, but they are pretending to not be part of that world and hanging out with people that maybe are a little more ordinary. Then if that is kind of part of your setup, then notice that there's this kind of pattern often with those archetypal characters where they go from power and fame early in the story to powerlessness, or kind of become more of a nobody, or just pretending to be someone they're not, to ultimately later getting revealed for who they are, often maybe coming back into power, as the Paul Atreides character does in Dune, or even Prince Hal in the Shakespeare stories. Of course, the detective, if you have a character who is ultimately trying to solve a mystery, maybe it's even just something like not a traditional murder mystery, but a character who's trying to track down their birth parents, then the plot of the story is going to hinge on a lot of gathering of clues and how they might go about that. You know, an underdog story often creates a very particular plot arc as well, where a character goes, you know, that classic rags to riches kind of evolution of the story. So being able to identify some of these archetypes, to look broadly at other stories that you know, because we all have like a vast knowledge of the books and movies and fairy tales and TV shows and everything that we have accumulated over the years. So we have kind of a sense for some of these roles that we see in the stories. And if you can kind of figure out how some of those characters in your stories are playing those roles, you might draw inspiration from what others have done. So this is not only kind of helpful, useful in this way, but it's also useful as we get to this next and final thing that I want to share with you about creating compelling characters is, how do you create a unique character? How do you do something new and different? And what's the secret to that? Certainly, we all, as writers, would love to be remembered for adding something new to the canon of literature, to create an iconic character that lives on and is, household name. But how do you do that today? I mean, it feels very hard to do something new when so much has been done before. We've seen a million detectives like a Sherlock Holmes. We've seen a million spies like a James Bond. We've seen a million romances like a Romeo and Juliet, or fantasy worlds like Lord of the Rings. And so we want to look for, how can we set this thing apart? If you are writing, a Holocaust story, for example, which we've seen a lot of Holocaust stories over the years, they are compelling for a reason. There's a reason that readers come back again and again to these types of stories, or even a kid going through a portal into a fantasy world, or a alcoholic police detective who's tracking down a killer or something like that. There are certain things that we've seen before because there's something that readers really like about that particular trope. But from a publisher standpoint, the publisher wants something that will stand out in the marketplace, that will set your story apart from what we have seen before. So again, what's the secret? How do we do that? Well, it's the same way that any new idea, any new invention comes about throughout human history, which is simply to put two things together that you haven't seen done before. This is how anything new comes about, something new and original. Mr. Reese's, actually, who invented the Reese's peanut butter cup, he worked for Hershey's chocolates. And when he left Hershey's chocolates, he wanted to start his own company. But what was he going to do? Was he just going to do another Hershey's chocolate style bar and call it the Reese's chocolate bar? No, he came up with this idea of setting apart from Hershey's by adding something new. At the time, this idea of combining peanut butter and chocolate was wildly original. And today we see how in chocolate bars, there's all sorts of ways that people are coming up with something new by adding just something we haven't seen before into chocolate, whether it's potato chips or chili peppers or bacon or whatever it might be. The iPhone really was something new and radically different at the time because it combined two things that we hadn't seen put together before, which was just a simple cell phone that we were using before to make calls and maybe do some texting. But now all of a sudden it was combined with a personal computer where you had access to all these websites and apps and other things that you could do as if you could on a computer. So this kind of getting into this mindset of understanding how that works can allow you to do new and interesting and original things in your stories, with your character development, as well as just with your plots. Let's take something like Sherlock Holmes and Nancy Drew. When Nancy Drew came along after Sherlock Holmes, she was very much like a Sherlock Holmes style detective, but with this addition of her being a teenager. When Richard Osman came out with the Thursday Murder Club, and just a couple of years ago, what felt really new and interesting and fresh about that was that there wasn't this one lone kind of genius detective, but there was a team of detectives all working together, this club, this Thursday Murder Club, who were, in this case, what was also interesting about it was that they're all retirees. They're all older, and they live in this retirement community together, and they're relatively amateurs. So that small quality of adding something new to what we've seen before can be, something that can really help your story, help your characters stand out. The book and the movie The Martian from several years ago by Andy Weir, you have something like a Robinson Crusoe castaway story, but the new element here was being castaway or marooned on Mars, being stuck in another world. I've got a book actually coming out in the fall called The Daughters of Mayhem. And part of this idea in The Daughters of Mayhem came about simply from looking at some of these old tropes and things that we've seen before and thinking about, how could I do something different with it? And I took that one that I mentioned earlier of the kind of fantasy hero who is, this ordinary person who is destined to save the world. And I felt like, oh, we've seen that a million times. Wouldn't it be interesting if we had an ordinary person who wasn't destined to save the world, but was destined to destroy the world? And now they have all these other, they don't understand, like, how in the world I'm not going to be able to destroy the world. I'm not that powerful or talented or even have the desire. I'm a good person. Except all these other people believe that about them. These other figures, these assassins and other groups are coming to after this character, thinking that they are destined to destroy the world. So sometimes just a little twist like that with your thinking, getting in that mindset of thinking about how you can add a new and unusual element into your story, into your characters, can help to have something that will set your story apart and to surprise publishers, agents, and editors who haven't seen this before. And it's a nice hook to make them compelled to want to know more. So these are some things that I hope that you will take away as you think about what to do to better develop your characters. And I also just want to mention that I'm about to start a new course that's on the art of novel writing. And some of this are just a few of this is like a small taste of just some of the topics that I cover in that course, as well as maybe a little bit from some of my other courses as well. But in this one that I'm leading on the art of novel writing, we get into a whole lot of other aspects of fiction development, no matter what kind of novel you are writing, whether it's for young readers, middle grade, young adult, or the adult marketplace, whether you're writing fantasy, whether you're writing something more literary, doesn't matter what the genre or the audience is. We cover topics like just how to structure your plots, how to give structure and interesting plotting into individual chapters and scenes, how to weave in subplots and add bridging conflict, and coming out with a strong opening first act in your story, creating a satisfying climax at the end, keeping the reader invested through the middle of your story, which a lot of people sometimes feel they get kind of lost in the middle and, where am I going to take the story now? Has a lot of techniques on handling point of view in a masterful way, narrative distance, dialogue, interiority, as well as just handling some of the more practical aspects of writing a novel, like the brainstorming of ideas, the early drafts, how to handle revisions, and of course, how to handle writer's block. I also teach a course on writing for young readers, which focuses on picture books and middle grade novels and early chapter books. And I also teach a course that is specific to plotting called Plot Your Novel, Plot Your Scene. So, all right. Well, Jacob.
Well, John, thank you so much. I have to say, I just thoroughly found that so engaging. As you're talking about all these different concepts, like I just keep thinking of all sorts of different books that they apply to.
Yep.
Like I'm currently reading a fantasy novel called The Will of the Many, and like it just like checks all these boxes. This book was written just to like pull you through every single page as quickly as possible. And I'm like, yes, this is what's happening. What John is teaching is what the author is doing, like very precisely. But then I thought about the Rachel Cusk, who is an author of very literary autofiction, and like her outline series is like written like you can't really find a more sort of literary book. Um, there's a character who like has a lot of agency, but the style is like written in this sort of lush, immersive sort of way where like not quite a reliable narrator. Like it's
Uh,
interesting how these books that are basically on opposite ends of the spectrum in terms of like pure genre versus like more literary, like these concepts of how to create a character that keeps you reading
yeah.
are like they both still apply, and I think it's really neat how you've like identified that and like cut through the noise to like figure out how like even when you're like writing a very literary difficult book versus like a book just designed to like keep you going no matter what,
Right.
like a lot of these same ideas still apply.
Yeah.
Anyways, You made me a little excited. So
Well, good, good. I'm glad. I know it's kind of fun just to to think about like how yes to think about those stories, books you've read, even movies and TV shows, and how people have used I think a lot of these tools and techniques, even whether they were conscious of using them or not. I think that
yeah.
these are so many of the things that across time have been helpful in creating compelling stories and good storytelling.
So we have a lot of questions. I will get to as many as I can. We have a question from Cheryl. What if it's about a fraught friendship and both characters change?
Yeah. Oh, yeah, yeah. So, because I made it sound like that you might just really just have this one protagonist, and sometimes a story can feel like that there is, or a story that has maybe alternating perspectives where we have several point of view or perspective characters in the story, and it's not as clear that there is this one protagonist, and that's certainly the case for many stories. So, I would say if that's the case then some of these techniques that I was mentioning for the protagonist in particular should apply to whatever that chapter or scene is for that particular perspective character.
Mhm.
Because I've often been in that case where I've done a story where I have alternating perspectives, and I'm kind of trying to decide whose perspective should this chapter be. And I often come back to these tools here of like, well, which character is the one that is struggling the most in this scene? Which is the character that is going to change or you know be the more active protagonist potentially in this scene, and that might be the right one to choose for the perspective character.
So it's okay to have like multiple protagonists, each
Uh,
going through their own sort of character arcs.
yes,
Yeah.
absolutely. Because in a lot of mysteries too, like you just don't want to have a clear protagonist. If there's like
Mhm.
and
Yeah.
then there were none, kind of Agatha Christie. There's not this one protagonist who, because otherwise it kind of
Yeah.
spoils the ending. So
Yeah.
yes, it's certainly okay to have multiple perspective characters who kind of might all kind of fill that role of a potential protagonist. So
That makes sense.
yeah,
So we have a question from Nancy. If you make a character a combination of archetypes, does it get too confusing for the reader?
just depends on how many you're using. I mean, I think combinations are always going to be, you know, uh, at play. Rarely is because that's where if you have one character, like an Eeyore who just always leans into being the eternal pessimist, and that's all they do, they can start to feel a little one dimensional. But if you
Hmm.
have a character who is a bit of a pessimist, but also a bit of plays a kind of mentor guide role, that kind of can create something interesting. But the more you layer onto it, the more it might start to muddy that character.
Yeah.
But what I often see writers do, and this is certainly what I try to do with it, is if I know that there's going to be a lot of those kind of layers to the character, is to be purposeful in how I introduce those various layers. That to maybe come in first with the character kind of stripped down and a little more distinguished by a particular archetype. But then as the story goes, we start to learn more and more about this character and get more depth and complexity. But they become more memorable off the bat if you don't throw too many things into the mix for them.
Yeah. That makes sense. It makes me think of the book I'm reading right now. There's a side character, they're introduced, and you think, oh, they're this archetype. And
Yeah.
then later on, a major plot point happens where you learn that's not actually the archetype they fit in. And so like
Right.
that discovery of who they actually, the archetype they're actually like is a really like engage it was a really engaging and satisfying point in the story.
Yeah. And on that note, I mean, it just makes me think how sometimes a character might just only adopt a certain archetypal role for a particular scene. It doesn't have to
Mhm.
carry across. It's just like kind of helps to serve that scene that you realize, like, oh, well, in this one particular moment, this character is kind of operating as, a mentor or a betrayer or a caregiver or whatever it might be.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We have a question from Lori. Do you have any suggestions around getting into the head of a character who is not at all like us, the writer, or not relatable, to prevent too much of self-talk trickling in
Oh
from
yeah.
the
So
writer?
that interiority part of it. Well, it's just something to think about when you get into the head of a character and the way you're presenting it to the reader. Readers like to have access to the thoughts and inner lives of our characters. I mean, this is truly one of the unique things about fiction is that you don't get that in real life. We don't have access to other people's
Hmm.
thoughts, and in movies, you don't really either. You're still having to largely make assumptions unless there's some kind of cheesy voiceover for the character. So it's something unique to fiction that readers really like. But I would urge you to think about how much you use it in terms of pacing to make sure that the character is actually, if you're weaving into the interiority and their thoughts, and that you're also balancing that with what they're doing and creating putting them in a place and time so that the reader can visualize in a slightly more cinematic way what is actually happening to this
Yeah.
character. So I'm not sure
And,
if I'm
and
that question.
and if the character is one that is just very far away from your own personal life experience,
Yeah,
do you have
yeah,
ideas of like how to like get there in terms of exploring that? Like,
yeah. I mean, you have to make a lot of assumptions, but
yeah.
ideally, making assumptions that are based on your experience with other people that you've known and met, or even experienced through literature.
Hmm.
So kind of looking to some of them to kind of get, yeah, I see what you're saying. You're kind of trying to get away from your own personal perspective and trying to get, well, how would this character handle it? Not how I would think about it or deal with it, but how this particular person would. And I think that's just I think maybe drawing on some of other characters or real life people to try to make some of those assumptions.
Yeah. I think also that's sometimes just something that takes work.
It
Like
does.
the work of writing can often be like figuring out those questions in a deep way.
It's certainly something I encounter in the course that I teach and my work on writing for young readers, where you often have a child protagonist, and as adults writing it, we're no longer children. So
Hmm.
it's having to kind of get back in that mindset of like, okay, not thinking like an adult. I got to think like a child. How would a child see this situation? And you're right. It just takes work and practice.
Let's see. We have a lot more questions. Let me find another one. Um, oh, Teresa wrote, what a fantastic teaching. I learned more today than ever before. Thank you. Well, that's a nice thought, Teresa. Thank you for that. Um, yeah. So we have a question from Ellis. Should sympathy come first and then empathy, like in the Harry Potter example, how he goes from abused home to Hogwarts, or can it be envy and then sympathy?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great question, and there's not one right answer. I mean, I think you have to feel it out as a reader. I think that just to some reason I have like Godfather in my head again, and I'm kind of thinking about the Michael Corleone introduction in the book and in the
Mhm.
movie. That it seems to lean more into the envy and admiration. We kind of admire him as a war hero coming back, but he's not coming back having been seemingly physically or emotionally, psychologically damaged from the war. It kind of leans into he's coming home and his family is happy to see him, and he comes from this strange family of mafia bosses and stuff like. And the sympathy only kind of comes a little later when his father is shot, and then Michael has to step into this role of helping with his family. So in that
Yeah.
case, it kind of comes in. It starts with the envy and then leans into the sympathy. But I think the key is just the idea of trying to lean into the opening of some sort of getting the reader to feel something strongly about the character, rather than just presenting the character in a kind of neutral way. Where we're learning intellectually some things about their life, but we're not given an opportunity to feel something about them and their lives. So
Yeah. So prioritize just evoking those feelings.
yeah, and
Yeah.
you decide in the end what works best for your story. If it's sympathy first and then envy, or envy first and then sympathy. It seems like in general, though, I think sympathy is just sometimes an easier hook for readers, and so
Hmm.
the Pixar movies famously do open with these
Yeah.
tear jerker opening scenes where they lean into the sympathy, and it works so well. So probably more often than not, people start with sympathy, but it doesn't have to go that way.
Yeah. And that can be kind of the game going on in the reader's head, especially if a character starts out unlikable, because most readers know that if you're going to be following a character for a while, you're supposed to eventually like them. So the game is kind of playing with that tension of, okay, when am I going to like this character?
Yeah, yeah, exactly. So, and you can not like a character, but still kind of envy them. Like this is
Yeah.
certainly how a lot of good villains work. We don't like them,
Hmm.
but we like admire how powerful they are or how
Yeah.
clever they are. So
Yeah, and often like the good villains, there is work done into creating that sympathy as well as the envy, right?
it's true. Yeah, yeah.
Um, we have a question from Rosaria. If a book features a single protagonist but multiple narrators, how do you give your protagonist a goal in the scenes they're not in?
Oh, and the scenes are not in. Well, if they're not in the scene, I mean, maybe the secondary characters are doing things that are ultimately going to help serve that protagonist or whatever the larger goal is. But in that moment, you might want to just try to treat one or more of those perspective characters or narrators in that moment as if they are a protagonist with goals,
Hmm.
and they're just making sure that they're doing those things that we touched on today about being an active, even if they're not truly a protagonist, just being a strong active character. So,
Um, so we have a question from Maristella. Um, what if the protagonist goal comes after the inciting incident?
yeah,
For example, in Spirited Away, Chihiro's main goal, saving her parents and returning to the human world, emerges as a direct result of the inciting incident.
exactly. Yes, usually the big goal that is going to be the driving force of the overall plot is going to come after an inciting incident, like in that
Hmm.
case. But we have what's called bridging conflict. Often that's used in the beginning of a story, meaning that it bridges it gets the reader invested in the character being active and wanting something to get us to that point where the real big moment occurs. And I think it's been a little while since I watched Spirited Away, but I think in the opening that the girl just wants to go see that old abandoned theme park or whatever it is.
Hmm.
So the want there is not the big goal want of the plot, but it's a minor goal or want of just wanting to go explore this environment. So that can be a goal for a character. It's almost like back to that Kurt Vonnegut quote of just wanting a glass of water. Sometimes it's just introducing at the beginning of a chapter or the beginning of the book a more minor want or a minor goal that is just going to help keep the reader invested in what's happening and keep the protagonist more active until we get to something that's more compelling and interesting that is going to occur and drive things.
That makes me wonder, like, how do you figure out or decide how compelling the goal for an individual scene should be?
Yeah, I mean, in that case, a good way of doing it is making back to the idea of strong emotions. Is the more that you can make the character deeply want this and deeply desire it, the the more the reader will care about it as well. That glass of water can feel relatively neutral, but if a
Hmm.
character is trying to confess their love to someone or needs to answer an important phone call and their voices they start coughing or they're dry, like then it can get there are ways to maybe just kind of tweak and manipulate the scene to draw more emotion out of it if the character is really the more desperate, the more the character wants this thing to occur, even if it's something small,
Yeah.
uh, the more that can kind of elevate the interest there.
So in a sense, it's not the goal as much as it is what it means to the
Yes.
to the character and
Yeah.
maybe how it will have consequences that play out later.
Absolutely, and I think you see this a lot of times in even some of the macro stories where it's like a end of the world scenario, an asteroid coming towards Earth. It's good just to kind of recognize that the reader ultimately doesn't really care as much about the asteroid destroying the Earth because it's somewhat abstract. That end of the world
Mm.
scenario is so big and abstract, and it's in a fictional environment. So if the Earth is destroyed in a book, it's not like it really happened. We care about that scenario when it's set up in a way that the character, the protagonist that we care about, and when they care about it, when they have a reason to want to fight to stop this asteroid or save the Earth or whatever it might be, this big kind of thing, we get more invested in it through the character's
Yeah.
desires. And
We're just about out of time, but I have one more question.
yeah,
I can see how you could go through all of this work for every single character that appears in a book, but I don't think most authors do that. Like, how do you decide which characters are worth thinking about in this way?
Um, I think, well, it kind of is, I guess, depends on how important they are to the overall plot. I mean, you can have a
Yeah.
very minor character in a story that can be a little more of just there for comedic relief, or just there as someone to occasionally come to for advice, and they can be a little thinner. But the more important the character is to the story, as we get almost like concentric circles, as we get closer to the middle, the most important characters, I think the more you want to start to put this work into thinking about, how much the character is going to exhibit the qualities that we kind of looked over today.
Yeah. Thank you so much. We are out of time, but John, I want to thank you for the engaging and fun hour of like learning and discussion.
Hey, can I
Um,
another thing, Jacob, which is that
yeah,
if people didn't get a question answered, do you want to say a little bit about joining for office hours? Because I'll be giving office hours for my course, and people can join
yeah,
that for.
yeah. If anyone who signs up for any of our courses, you're allowed to join office hours with any of our instructors, so you can always like um, join office. Even if you're not in John's course, if you're in another course, we send out regular invites to the office hours, and that's a great way for people to stay part of the community. Yeah, and if you do want to work with John, he teaches regularly for us, so lots of great information, and we always have like wonderful feedback about John's courses. So thank you for that, John. Yeah, and you do have a course open for enrollment right now. I'll send a little bit of information about that for those who are interested when I send out the recording. And yeah, thank you to everybody who's being here. And you can always reach me at support@authorspublish.com. I love hearing from the people who attend the lectures. Thank you to everyone behind the scenes who makes these possible. And yeah, thank you, John. You can always look up John, John Claude Bemis. If you do a Google search, that should take you to his website. Yeah. And is there anything else you want to leave our audience with today?
Just how much I've enjoyed it, and I appreciate everyone joining me on this Saturday morning, evening, night, whenever it is for you, you in the world. But this has been a real treat for me. So thank you for the invitation, Jacob.
Yeah, of course. Thank you so much, and have a wonderful rest of your day. And thank you everyone for being here.